I'm Cole Bennett, 47, and the HOA fined me $5,200 for installing a wheelchair ramp for my wife. At the board meeting, Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, stood up, pointed at our house's photo on the projector and said, "That wooden monstrosity looks like something from a trailer park. This neighborhood deserves better than your taste." It wasn't a quiet remark. She said it right into the mic. The room didn't gasp, not out loud, but I saw the discomfort on some faces. Others, the ones closest to Karen, nodded. A few whispered and smirked. My wife Rachel wasn't there that evening. I had begged her to stay home. Thank God she listened. I think if she'd heard what was said in person, she'd have never left the house again. Karen continued like she was reciting scripture. The guidelines are very clear. External modifications must match the aesthetic of the community. This ramp doesn't. If we allow one exception, the integrity of the entire neighborhood collapses. They voted 4-1. I sat there in that folding chair, biting my tongue so hard I tasted blood. They were ordering me to tear down the very thing that gave my wife her independence. Not a garage addition, not a pool, a damn ramp. After the meeting, I stood outside in the parking lot. The fluorescent lights from the rec center buzzed above me. One neighbor passed and muttered, "You should have asked first." Another avoided eye contact completely. I leaned against my truck and stared into nothing. There was a tightness in my chest I hadn't felt since Afghanistan, that low hot burn of helplessness. I had kept my cool, but something had shifted in me that night. They thought I was just some quiet handyman vet with a limp and a rusted pickup. But I had something Karen didn't. Patience, and a blueprint for revenge so subtle, so painfully legal that it would unravel their entire kingdom. But before I tell you what happened on that day, let me explain how it all began. For the HOA turned our life into a minefield of petty rules and paper fines. Rachel and I had finally found peace. After nearly a decade of moving between base housing motels and tight apartments, while I was active duty, settling down in Willow Creek felt like a dream. A clean tree-lined neighborhood, wide sidewalks, birds instead of helicopters, neighbors who smiled when they walked their dogs. It was quiet, predictable. That's what we wanted. Rachel was injured just months before I retired. A car accident not even related to my deployments left her with a spinal cord injury that changed everything. The first year was brutal. Surgery, rehab, grief in strange forms. But Rachel was tough, stronger than anyone I served with. By year 2, she was making jokes about her wheelchair, customizing it with decals naming it the Tank. That woman could have made anyone laugh, even while rolling through hell. When we bought the house on Hemlock Drive, she cried on the porch. "I can see us getting old here," she whispered. That house became our symbol of survival. We used my VA loan and some savings to get it. It wasn't flashy, but it was ours. The front yard had a gentle slope perfect for a ramp. I knew the minute I saw it that this place could give Rachel something she hadn't had since the accident: autonomy. So I built the ramp myself. Nothing fancy, just sturdy, pressure-treated lumber, smooth incline railings for safety. I triple-checked the grade for ADA compliance, even stained it to match the trim of the house. I took photos of it from the curb. You could barely even see it behind the bushes. We moved in during spring, and at first the neighbors were kind. A few brought over welcome muffins. One woman, Joyce, offered to help us find a local physical therapist. And then there was Karen. Karen introduced herself on day 3. She marched right over, clipboard in hand, wearing that type of sun visor people wear when they want to look sporty, but never sweat. She didn't even shake Rachel's hand, just gave her a glance, then turned to me and said, "I assume you'll be painting over that ramp, right?" I blinked. "It's stained to match the house." "Stain isn't paint," she replied, writing something down. "And modifications require advance approval. You'll find all this in your HOA packet." She gave a tight-lipped smile that never touched her eyes. "But we're glad to have you here." That was our first conversation. And things didn't exactly improve after that. For a while, I brushed it off. Karen seemed like a harmless bureaucrat with too much time. She had a flair for control and a constant stream of passive-aggressive emails sent from the HOA president account. At first, I chuckled at them. Subject lines like "trash bins visible, not compliant," or "front door wreaths, please review seasonal guidelines." You had to laugh or you'd go mad. But I should have seen the signs. She was targeting us, early little things, notices about our trash bins being too close to the sidewalk, a photo of Rachel's wheelchair van parked slightly crooked in the driveway. She even sent a warning because our motion light was distracting. One night, Rachel asked me if I thought she was the problem. That hit me like a brick. I tried to reassure her, told her Karen was probably just a busybody bored out of her skull. But deep down, something told me it was more than that. Something meaner. This wasn't about rules, it was about control. Still, I didn't want to stir up trouble. I'd spent most of my life dealing with people who bark orders. Karen didn't intimidate me, but I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted to live quietly, fix up the garden, get Rachel into her ceramics class, grill on weekends. But peace was temporary. One day, Rachel came home from her book club in tears. A woman there had mentioned Karen's recent HOA email, calling the ramp an unfortunate choice in a neighborhood striving for elegance. That was the first time I really saw my wife shrink. I knew then that something had to give, but I still believed I could reason with them. So I sent a letter, a calm, formal one explaining Rachel's condition. The ramp's compliance even attached a copy of the ADA guidelines. I offered to add lattice skirting to make it blend in more. I signed it respectfully, hoping common sense would prevail. They didn't even reply. Instead, 2 days later, I got the official notice, remove the ramp within 30 days or face daily fines. And Karen. She walked by our driveway the next morning, sipping her overpriced iced coffee, glanced at Rachel being helped into the house and said, "I'm sure you'll find a better solution that's less intrusive." That was the first time I truly hated someone. I wish I could say the escalation was gradual, but it was like flipping a switch. The moment that 30-day warning came in, the HOA turned into a full-on surveillance state. Karen must have decided that subtle bullying wasn't working fast enough, so she stepped things up with military-grade obsession. And I don't use that term lightly. It started with the daily fines, $50 per day increasing to $100 after the first week. Every morning I'd find another pink slip shoved under our door or tucked into the mailbox, non-compliant structure still in place. Penalty accrued. Some of them even came with photos. Karen would clearly walk past the house and snap shots of the ramp like it was a crime scene. She'd mark them with timestamps, angles, and handwritten notes like visibility from sidewalk high. I started saving every single one in a manila folder. I labeled it the War on Wood. Then came the letters, not just fines but threats. Talk of liens on the house, referrals to legal counsel. They said we were degrading property values and that we were knowingly violating community integrity. Their language was so absurd it would have been funny if it didn't mean Rachel might lose the only accessible way into her home. I tried contacting the board directly. I emailed each member, some of whom had waved to me just weeks before. Most of them never responded. One finally replied, "It's not personal, Mr. Bennett. The rules are the rules." And when I asked for the specific clause I had broken, they quoted a vague sentence about aesthetic harmony, a clause that could mean anything or nothing at all. Meanwhile, Karen kept pushing. She began leaving passive-aggressive notes on our door. "Please be considerate of your neighbor's views." Or my favorite, "We all have challenges, some just choose not to make them, everyone else's problem." I'll never forget the day I saw her walk up to our porch clipboard, in hand look straight at the Ring camera and mutter, "I warned you, Cole." Then she photographed the ramp again and walked away like she was tagging a condemned building. But she wasn't just targeting the ramp anymore. She went after the van. Suddenly, the HOA announced new driveway uniformity standards. We got a violation for parking a vehicle longer than the permitted dimensions, even though our van was shorter than several SUVs on the block. She tried to claim our wheelchair accessible lift was a mechanical attachment that violated policy. Then she sent a complaint about Rachel's potted garden. Just 3 ceramic pots beside the ramp, tomatoes, basil, and a little lavender plant she liked to rub between her fingers. Karen called it clutter. That one hit hard. Those herbs were one of the few things Rachel could still tend to on her own. And now even that was being stripped away. Our mailbox became a weapon. Every week brought some new absurdity. Rachel started flinching every time she heard the mail flap. It was around that time that a few neighbors stopped waving. I could feel the isolation creeping in like a fog. We had become those people, the ones you don't invite to the block party because they stir things up. Karen had painted us as selfish, disruptive, and inconsiderate. I caught wind that she had told people I built the ramp in secret to spite the HOA and that Rachel was milking her condition for sympathy. But there were a few who still stood with us. There was Mr. Donnelly, the elderly veteran down the street, who told me if they ever come for my porch steps, I'll chain myself to the railing. He dropped off banana bread one morning with no note, just a post-it Semper Fi. And there was the Martinez family 2 houses down, whose teenage daughter left a chalk drawing of a heart in a wheelchair on our driveway with the words, "You belong here." It helped, a little. But inside, something was turning in me. All my life, I'd been trained to assess threats, study weaknesses, and execute with precision. For the first time in years, I could feel that old instinct kicking in, not with anger, but with clarity. I wasn't going to fight her with fists or foul words. That would have played into her hands. She wanted us to snap to rage, to break a window, or shout at a neighbor. She wanted the story to become our misconduct. No, I was going to do what she least expected. Obey, comply, but only on the surface. Because if Karen loved rules so much, I was going to show her just how deep the rule book went, especially the ones she and her precious HOA had been ignoring for years. I stopped arguing. I stopped emailing. I even told Rachel, let her think we've given up. And quietly, without fanfare, I opened my laptop and started downloading blueprints, regulations, and ADA codes that would make Karen's clipboard look like a napkin. She thought she'd won. She had no idea that I was already building something far more devastating than a ramp. The hardest part wasn't the fines or the threats or even the looks from neighbors who now saw us as some sort of local scandal. It was watching Rachel fade. She tried to keep a brave face. God did she try, but I could see the weight pressing down on her every day. That ramp had given her something more than physical access. It gave her dignity, autonomy, confidence. And now every time she looked at it all, she saw was the fight. She started avoiding the front door altogether. Would rather sit on the back porch quietly watching birds than risk another run-in with Karen or her clipboard of cruelty. Her ceramics wheel gathered dust. Her book club group stopped calling. She didn't say it out loud, but I knew she was ashamed, like her very existence had become a disruption. One night, she wheeled herself into the kitchen, where I was reheating some leftover chili, and said, "Maybe we should just take it down. I hate how everyone's staring." I didn't answer right away. I was afraid I might say something I'd regret. Instead, I turned off the stove, sat across from her, and said, "You didn't do anything wrong." I know that she replied softly, but it doesn't feel like it matters. I reached across the table, took her hand, and squeezed it. They think this ramp is the problem. They have no idea what's coming. It wasn't bravado, I meant it. But I could also tell it didn't comfort her, not yet. The next morning, the HOA delivered a formal notice via certified mail. A lawyer had drafted it. It was 10 pages long and filled with legalese citing violations, breach of covenants, and imminent daily penalties. If we didn't remove the ramp within 14 days, they claimed they could initiate foreclosure proceedings based on unpaid fines. That was the moment it stopped being annoying and became real. They were coming for our home. I didn't tell Rachel that part. I folded the letter neatly and tucked it into the same manila folder as the rest, but now I labeled the back final straw. That evening, I sat alone in the garage staring at the ramp. Not at its wood or rails or slope, but what it meant. The HOA saw it as a blemish. I saw it as a flag planted on hostile ground. And suddenly a memory came to me, not from war, but from the training camps. I had once spent an entire week learning AD compliance for a forward operating base hospital being built in a desert. It wasn't glamorous, but the Department of Defense didn't mess around when it came to regulations. There were binders, charts, exact measurements for door frames, slopes, handrails, signage. And Karen had no idea any of it applied to her. I pulled out my old laptop, long retired from service, and booted it up. It took a while. The thing sounded like a helicopter, but eventually I was staring at folders full of scanned manuals, site assessments, and ADA enforcement contacts. I downloaded the latest documents, reviewed public access codes, and even printed out the federal guidelines for residential common areas. The more I read, the more I realized something that made my heart race, not with fear, but anticipation. The entire neighborhood was non-compliant. The sidewalks lacked proper curb cuts. The community park had gravel walkways instead of paved paths. The clubhouse had stairs at every entrance and no visible ramps or automatic door access. The community pool, which Karen proudly flaunted as a luxury amenity, had no lift chair, not a single handrail, not even accessible restrooms. This wasn't just a battle over my ramp anymore. This was a battlefield of violations. And I knew how to draw the map. Over the next several days, I walked the neighborhood clipboard in hand. Just like Karen, I even wore a visor. It amused me more than it should have. But I wasn't being petty, I was being thorough. I took photos, measured slopes, jotted down curb grades, snapped images of narrow sidewalks and uneven paths. I documented every point of entry into community buildings and marked down each infraction. I went full reconnaissance mode. By the end of the week, I had a report 43 pages long, complete with photos, highlighted code citations, timestamp violations, and a drafted complaint to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. It was beautiful. I also included one more thing, a note explaining that I had been formally fined and harassed for installing an ADA-compliant ramp to assist a disabled resident, while the very HOA enforcing these fines was in direct violation of multiple federal accessibility laws. I didn't yell, I didn't protest, I didn't stage a rally. I just submitted the report through the proper channel certified mail and CC'd the city's Building Compliance Office, the Office of Disability Rights, and the ADA enforcement contact I found through my old DOD channels. Then I waited. I didn't say a word to anyone. I let Karen believe we were worn down. I kept letting the fines come, kept stacking them in the folder, kept nodding politely when she walked by, and smirked. Inside, I was a volcano sealed under snow. Rachel noticed the shift. One night, she caught me humming while taking out the trash. Something changed, she asked. I just smiled. Let's just say I filed a little paperwork. She laughed. A genuine laugh. It was the first time in weeks. It was a Saturday morning when the dam finally cracked. Rachel and I were sitting on the back porch. The air smelled like cut grass and cheap sunscreen, and for the first time in a while, she seemed lighter. We were sipping coffee, talking about getting about something small and annoying. We joked just to see if Karen would try to fine us for excessive barking. Then we heard the commotion from out front. Voices, shouting. I stepped onto the lawn and saw Karen Visor on clipboard and hand arms flailing, standing in the middle of the street. A few neighbors were gathered around. She was red in the face, arguing with a man in a suit who was calmly holding a tablet and gesturing toward the sidewalk. I knew immediately. The inspectors had arrived. City-issued vehicles lined the curb. A white van labeled ADA Compliance Division was parked just down the street. 3 officials in polos and khakis were methodically examining the community clubhouse entrance. Another measured the slope of the main sidewalk with a long silver leveler. Karen noticed me standing there and narrowed her eyes like she was trying to x-ray my soul. She turned back to the inspector and snapped, "Why are you even here? Who filed this complaint?" The man, calm as a lake, replied, "Ma'am, I'm not authorized to share that. But your HOA is legally obligated to meet federal accessibility requirements for all public community areas." She looked like someone had just told her her house was being airlifted away. I stayed on my lawn and didn't say a word, just watched. For the rest of the day, the inspectors documented everything. Sidewalks, clubhouse, entrances, restrooms, recreational spaces, even the picnic tables. They had cameras, tablets, measuring tools, and they were thorough. A few residents came out to watch. Some looked confused. A few looked nervous. Karen, on the other hand, was unraveling. She stormed from site to site, demanding credentials, accusing them of harassment, insisting that our neighborhood has never had complaints before. One inspector nodded politely and said, "Well, now you do." By dusk, the inspectors left. Karen retreated into her house like a spooked cat, and I knew this was just the beginning. But the real crack, the one that broke something inside me, came the next day. It was the neighborhood BBQ. Rachel wanted to go. She hadn't been to a community event in months. She even wore a blue sundress with little yellow flowers, and I'll be damned if she didn't look radiant. She rolled beside me in her chair, hair pinned back, her old sparkle returning. But as we approached the gathering at the park's picnic area, Karen intercepted us. She stood in front of Rachel like a sentry. "I'm going to ask you to leave," she said, her voice flat. "This event is for residents in good standing. And given your current violation status, I don't think it's appropriate." It took me a second to register what she was doing. "You're banning us from a potluck?" I asked. Karen crossed her arms. "You can come back once the ramp is removed." Rachel didn't say anything. She just sat there perfectly still, staring at the tablecloths and kids playing tag in the grass. I watched her shoulders fall. Her hand loosened on the wheel rim. Her dress fluttered in the breeze like a flag at half-mast. I looked at Karen and said quietly, "You don't see her, do you?" She tilted her head, confused. "You don't see a human being in front of you, just a violation." Karen didn't answer. She just turned and walked away. We left. Rachel didn't cry. She didn't say anything at all. And that silence, it felt heavier than any words. That night, after putting Rachel to bed, I went into the garage. I stood there under the bare bulb, breathing, not thinking, just feeling the weight of it all. Then I pulled out the thick envelope I had prepared weeks ago. It was addressed to every resident of the neighborhood. Inside a copy of the ADA complaint, annotated with the violations found in common areas and a note written in simple, direct language. It explained that the same HOA that fined a disabled woman for needing access was in breach of federal law, that any lawsuit brought against the HOA would impact every homeowner financially, that every person who attended the BBQ at the clubhouse, the pool, the walking trail had been using a space that could be shut down indefinitely. Then I added one more thing, a picture of Rachel, smiling, sitting on the ramp. The caption below read, "This is who they're trying to remove." I delivered them the next morning, quietly, door to door. Karen wanted to make Rachel invisible. I was going to make her the face of everything. By that evening, the neighborhood's private Facebook group exploded. Screenshots trickled in from sympathetic neighbors. People were angry, confused, some embarrassed. Karen tried to defend herself, writing long, rambling posts about visual consistency and legal obligations. But it was too late. The image had already spread. Rachel wasn't a code violation. She was a person. And they saw her now. It's strange, the kind of quiet that comes after a firestorm. The day after I delivered those letters, our street felt different. Not louder, not chaotic, but more alert. Neighbors didn't avoid eye contact anymore. A few even stopped me during my morning walk. Some offered awkward apologies. One woman, arms full of groceries, whispered, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." And I believed her. Most of them didn't know. Karen had kept them shielded from the truth. Her version of control came with polite phrases and flowery newsletters. The same kind of poison people drink because it's served with a smile. But now the curtain was pulled back. Rachel, for the first time in weeks, came outside to sit on the ramp in the late afternoon sun. She was cautious at first, head down, pretending to scroll through her phone. Then something remarkable happened. Joyce from across the street came over with a tray of lemonade. No pretense, no pity, just a neighbor being decent. They talked for nearly an hour. I watched from the garage and let the moment breathe. It wasn't a parade, but it was something real. A slow rebuilding, a seed in healthy soil. And while the community began to thaw, I went to work in the shadows. Karen had always loved to weaponize bureaucracy. I decided it was time to beat her at her own game, but with precision she couldn't match. I reached out to an old contact from my engineering days, Gavin, a civil compliance consultant, who owed me a favor after I helped redesign a base in Texas. He had deep knowledge of ADA enforcement, but more importantly, he knew how to trigger audits. We spoke over the phone for an hour. I explained the situation. I told him I'd already filed the initial report, but the HOA board was likely to try and sweep the findings under the rug. "That's fine," he said. "If they don't comply after formal notice, the fines jump from thousands to six figures. That'll get the city's attention." He was right. 2 weeks later, the neighborhood received official correspondence from the ADA Enforcement Office. The letter stated that the community was under active investigation. Attached was a preliminary list of violations and a deadline for corrective action. If those items weren't addressed, the letter warned all common areas will be deemed non-accessible and subject to closure until further notice. Karen was nowhere to be seen for 2 days. When she finally resurfaced, she called an emergency HOA meeting. This time, instead of the community center, they held it in her backyard, likely to avoid photos. I showed up early, took a seat, and waited. She stood in front of the group, visibly shaken. No visor, no clipboard. Her voice trembled slightly as she tried to explain the situation, that federal investigators had overstepped, that the violations were exaggerated, and that she was working on a solution. The room was restless. A man named Tom, someone I barely knew, raised his hand. "Did you really tell the board to fine them for a wheelchair ramp?" Karen faltered. "That's not how I would phrase it." "Then how would you phrase it?" another woman asked. Karen looked around, realizing no one was shielding her anymore. She tried to pivot. "What's important is that we address these issues as a community. I propose we raise dues temporarily to fund necessary upgrades." That was it. A woman stood up. "You want us to pay for this after you caused it?" Another voice. "This is your mess, Karen." Someone else added, "How much have we paid in legal fees because of this ramp thing?" The tension boiled. I didn't say a word. I just watched her sweat. Later that evening, I received a letter from the board signed by 2 members who had abstained from the original vote. It stated that all fines against our property had been rescinded. They were deeply sorry for the harm caused, and a motion had been introduced to remove Karen as board president. It felt satisfying, but I wasn't finished. Because symbolic justice wasn't enough. I wanted structural change. So I did something Karen would never expect. I offered to help. At the next meeting, I stood before the board and the neighbors and presented a plan. A step-by-step roadmap to bring every common area into full ADA compliance. Costs timelines suggested contractors. I even offered to supervise the process pro bono using my credentials. There was silence when I finished. Then Tom spoke. Why would you help us after all this? I looked at Rachel, then back at them, because I don't want another family to go through what we did. And because community doesn't mean hiding behind rules, it means showing up. The motion passed. Karen didn't speak a word. She walked out quietly, her reign finally over. The first time I walked into the community clubhouse after all the dust had settled, it felt like stepping into a place that had been held hostage and was finally free. The walls were still the same beige, the chairs still those awkward stackables that squeaked when you moved. But there was something else now, breathing room. My plan to renovate the neighborhood wasn't just a power move, it was a message. I didn't want a token apology or a settlement. I wanted permanence, real change. And I knew the only way that would happen was if I stayed involved. So I rolled up my sleeves. We started with the basics. The clubhouse needed an accessible entrance, not a side ramp tucked in behind a dumpster, but a proper front-facing entry. We contracted a veteran-owned construction team I'd worked with years ago. They knew ADA code like the back of their hands. We reviewed slope requirements, clearance widths, door handle heights. I walked the site with a laser-level clipboard in hand, not unlike Karen, except mine was backed by law and ethics, not ego. The city's compliance office was impressed, said they hadn't seen a community so responsive after a violation. I didn't tell them it wasn't really responsiveness. It was survival. The HOA board knew that one more misstep could bankrupt them with federal fines. And Karen. She was gone, voted out in a nearly unanimous decision. She tried to hang on, made a desperate plea about protecting property values and maintaining neighborhood standards. But even her allies had jumped ship. Still, I didn't celebrate, not publicly, not yet. Instead, I worked and I watched, because part of me knew Karen wouldn't just vanish. People like her don't go quietly. They wait, they stew, they look for cracks in the wall. And sure enough, 3 weeks into the renovation process, I got wind that Karen had begun circulating a petition not to undo the ramp or reverse the ADA changes, but to dissolve the HOA entirely. Her logic was slick. If the HOA didn't exist, it couldn't be sued. No more liability, no more upgrades, just abandonment. I understood the appeal. Homeowners were scared. Fees were rising temporarily to cover the upgrades. The board was shaken. Some residents resented the whole mess, especially those who hadn't read the full story. Karen fed off that fear. She was trying to slip in through the back door while I was focused on rebuilding the front. So I changed tactics. I went public. I put together a neighborhood forum at the new community center, the same one we were retrofitting for access. I printed full-color packets with before and after photos of the upgrades, budget breakdowns, contractor timelines, and a projected drop in legal risk. But I also included testimonials, not legal ones, personal ones. Rachel's was at the top. In it, she wrote, "This ramp didn't make me visible. It made me equal." The room was packed. People brought lawn chairs and folding stools. Some just stood in the back. And when I finished speaking, I said something I hadn't planned to something from the gut. I know some of you are tired of all this, but change isn't chaos, it's work. Real community isn't about rules, it's about access. And that means everyone belongs. Then I passed out a single-page flyer why we can't let fear win. The petition died within 48 hours. Karen didn't show her face at the next board election. Rumor was she'd moved in with her daughter a few towns over. Someone said she blamed me for ruining her retirement. If that's true, I hope she learns what it feels like to live under someone else's idea of what's acceptable. I hope she grows, but I'm not waiting on it. With the renovations in full swing and the board stabilized, I added one final touch to the setup, a discreet bronze plaque at the base of the ramp. It read, "Freedom is built one step at a time," in honor of Rachel Bennett. She cried when she saw it. Not loud, not messy, just a few tears sliding down her cheek as she wheeled herself up and down the ramp twice. Then she kissed my hand and said, "You did this." I didn't correct her. I didn't say we did it, because she was right. I did do this, but not for me, for her. For everyone who ever got told to move, to shut up, to blend in. For the quiet people, the forgotten ones, the ones who don't raise their voices because they never believed anyone would listen. Now they had a ramp. Now they had a voice. Now it was time for the final play. It happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the last major inspection was complete. By then, the sidewalks had been resurfaced with proper curb cuts. The community center boasted 2 newly installed automatic doors, and the once crumbling pool deck now had a hydraulic lift chair, which I personally tested by getting in fully clothed just to make the kids laugh. It was all working. The plan had become real, and yet I knew the real test hadn't arrived. Not yet. Then came the email from the Office of Civil Rights and the public notice they posted online for everyone to see. Willow Creek HOA has been found in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. A formal warning has been issued, and further noncompliance will result in legal dissolution and federal penalties. Residents and stakeholders are encouraged to attend a mandatory hearing to discuss the findings. That hearing was scheduled at the City Municipal Center. Open to the public. Media welcome. I showed up in a button-down shirt and jeans. No fanfare. Rachel wheeled beside me wearing a pin that said "Access for All." A few board members were already there, nervously flipping through binders and whispering to each other. The city officials sat at a long table with microphones and solemn expressions. And there, sitting in the back row, was Karen. She wore a gray pantsuit, no visor, no clipboard, just that tight-lipped smirk she wore like armor. I don't know what possessed her to show up. Maybe she thought she could defend herself. Maybe she thought this was her redemption or arc. Maybe, just maybe, she was afraid of what would be said and wanted the last word. She wouldn't get it. The hearing began with a summary of the violations. The city inspector read aloud from a document that listed 15 separate failures to meet minimum ADA standards, some dating back to the original design of the neighborhood. It was read slowly, methodically, with zero emotion, just the facts. Then came the public comment period. I didn't plan on speaking, but Rachel nudged my elbow gently and whispered, "It's time." So I stood. I'm Cole Bennett. I live on Hemlock Drive, and I'm the guy who installed the wheelchair ramp that started all this. There was a faint rustle in the crowd. A few people leaned forward. My wife Rachel has been in a wheelchair since before we moved into Willow Creek. When we bought our house, we thought we were joining a community. What we found instead was an enforcement committee that cared more about wood stain and symmetry than human lives. I paused, then looked straight at Karen. We were fined, humiliated, and isolated. All because I dared to build a ramp. Not a flagpole, not a fountain, a ramp. The only thing that allowed my wife to leave our home with dignity. And while we were being punished, this same HOA was sitting on a mountain of violations far more serious than anything we'd ever done. I turned to the panel. I'm not here to beg. I'm not even here for revenge anymore. I'm here because I don't want anyone else to suffer because of negligence disguised as tradition. I stepped back down and took my seat. There was silence. Then one of the panelists asked, "Is Ms. Karen Walters present?" Karen stood slowly. She adjusted her jacket, smoothed her hair, and approached the microphone. She tried to sound measured, reasonable. She claimed she acted within the framework, provided that the guidelines were interpreted as best as possible and that she never intended harm. But the room had changed. People weren't nodding anymore. They were narrowing their eyes. A few had even crossed their arms. Karen faltered. I was only doing what the rules required," she said. A man from the back of the room spoke out. Then maybe the rules were the problem. Karen's eyes flared for a second, but she said nothing more. The panel closed the hearing, stating that the final decision would be released in writing within 5 business days. It took 2. The verdict. The HOA must either implement full compliance within 60 days or dissolve as a governing body. But that wasn't the twist. The city had decided to take it one step further. They launched an educational initiative using Willow Creek as a case study for how not to manage accessibility, a real-time example of failed oversight. They even asked if I'd be willing to speak at a future seminar for developers and HOA boards. I said yes. The local paper ran a piece titled "From Ramp to Revolution: How One Family Changed a Neighborhood." It featured a photo of Rachel on the ramp holding a mug of tea, smiling like the queen she is. As for Karen, she left quietly again. For good this time. Her house went up for sale. A "for sale by owner" sign sat crooked in her yard for weeks before a realtor took over. Last I heard, she moved to a retirement condo in another district, one with no HOA. The irony was not lost on me. It's a surreal thing watching the very machine that once tried to crush you sputter crack and finally collapse under its own weight. The official notice came in a thick envelope, addressed to every homeowner. The HOA would be dissolving effective immediately. The board was disbanded and property management duties would shift to a third-party service, while the neighborhood transitioned to a non-HOA community. I stood at the mailbox holding the letter like it was a relic from a war long over. I didn't feel joy exactly. I felt weightlessness, the kind that comes when you have been carrying something heavy for so long, you forget what life feels like without it pressing into your chest. Rachel read the notice 3 times before believing it. Then she smiled so wide I thought her cheeks might crack. "So, that's it?" she asked. "They're really gone." "Gone," I said. "You outlasted them." We sat on the porch that evening, watching the street fill with the ordinary sounds of life, kids on bikes, dogs barking, a dad chasing a toddler in circles around a sprinkler. It was nothing remarkable, and that was the beauty of it. We could finally exist without scrutiny. No one cared that Rachel's garden pots were visible, or that our motion light flicked on too brightly, or that the ramp had a railing that didn't match the rest of the porch. Freedom is quiet. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood actually improved. Without Karen's iron grip, people began talking again, sharing tools, offering to help paint fences. It was like some unspoken toxin had been purged. Tom from the board stopped by one afternoon with a 6-pack and said, "You know, I thought losing the HOA would be chaos, but I think we were living in chaos already. We just called it order." He stayed for a beer, then 2. Rachel started hosting a monthly accessibility lunch on our lawn, inviting people from outside the neighborhood too. It turned into this informal gathering of folks with mobility needs, caregivers, and curious locals who wanted to learn how to make their own spaces more inclusive. One woman cried when she saw our ramp, said it was the first time in a decade she'd been able to attend a house party without needing help from strangers. We called it Rolling Welcome. Meanwhile, I followed through on the speaking offer from the city. At the seminar, I stood in front of a crowd of architects, property managers, and yes, other HOA officials, and told them our story. I didn't shout, I didn't shame, I just told the truth. I showed them a photo of Rachel stuck inside the house before the ramp, then another of her rolling down it with her sunglasses on, holding a grocery bag in one hand and her keys in the other like a damn rock star. "This is what compliance looks like," I told them. "Not just ramps and railings. This, a person reclaiming her life." People clapped. A few stood. I wasn't doing it for applause, but it mattered. Still, not everything was rosy. There was fallout. The HOA had used reserve funds to pay legal counsel before the dissolution. Some residents were upset about that, about the money lost, about the leadership vacuum. I listened to their concerns, offered contacts for responsible property managers, and reminded them freedom comes with effort. We'd been living under unchecked power for too long. Now we were building something together. Some folks took longer to come around, but most did. Karen's house eventually sold. A young couple bought it. I met them while walking the dog one morning. Yes, we got a dog. A yappy little mutt with a crooked tail and a bark bigger than his body. Rachel named him Rampage. Fitting. The new couple didn't know the full history. They asked about the mailbox policy. I laughed and said, "There isn't one anymore. Just be a good neighbor." And that's what we were all becoming. Neighbors. Not enforcers, not factions, just people sharing space, sharing life, figuring it out. One evening, Rachel wheeled up beside me on the porch, wine glass in hand, and said, "Do you think it would have ended this way if you hadn't pushed back?" I thought about it, about the weight of it all. "No," I said, "but I didn't do it alone." She leaned her head against my shoulder. "You never do." "Not really." We sat there a long while, the ramp glowing golden in the sunset. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a soldier, or a fighter, or a man on guard. I just felt home. The strange thing about peace is how easily you forget the noise that came before it. Not so long ago, I used to check the mailbox with a tight chest and a sense of dread. Now I check it for coupons and pizza flyers. Where once I tracked Karen's every movement like she was a predator circling the perimeter, now I can't even recall what her voice sounds like without effort. That's how healing begins, quietly. Rachel and I settled into our new normal, and it was beautiful in its simplicity. Mornings with coffee and crossword puzzles. Evenings with neighbors. Yes, neighbors, not opponents who drop by just to say hi, not to spy or accuse or deliver another complaint. But more than the change outside, I felt a shift in myself. For years after I left the military, I carried this tension. I was always ready, not just alert ready, to act, to respond, to control a situation. I thought I needed that instinct to survive, but Karen reminded me of something deeper, that control is just another name for fear if you're not careful. And I had been careful for too long. Now I'm not careful, I'm present. I joined a local accessibility advisory group. They meet at the library once a month and we talk about ramps, bathroom widths, sidewalk grading, things most people don't think about until they need them. I help veterans navigate local codes when they deal with HOA resistance. We've even started offering a certification access ally for neighborhoods that voluntarily go above the minimum standards. We've got 2 already signed up. Rachel went back to her ceramics class. She's made a dozen coffee mugs each with a small hand-painted ramp etched into the side. She calls them Justice Cups. They sell surprisingly well at the local art fair. She's also started mentoring younger women with new mobility challenges. They come over, sit on the porch, drink tea, and talk about everything from healthcare frustrations to how to accessorize a wheelchair. Watching her guide others not from bitterness, but strength reminds me why I fought in the first place. Not for the ramp, not even for revenge, for her voice. And for mine, because here's the truth, I didn't want to become the guy who had to tear down a system just to be heard. But sometimes that's exactly who the world needs, someone who understands how to dismantle the quiet violence of rules made by the comfortable for the convenience of others. I learned that justice isn't just punishment, it's clarity. It's a community that says you belong, not prove that you do. One night I found Rachel sitting at the edge of the ramp watching the moon rise. She had a soft smile on her face and her fingers brushed the bronze plaque, the one we installed months ago. It still read, "Freedom is built one step at a time," in honor of Rachel Bennett. She looked up at me and said, "It still doesn't feel real." "It is," I said, "and you made it real." She shook her head, but I stopped her. "No more shrinking," I told her. "You changed lives. This ramp changed lives. And it's going to keep doing that." Because I had one last surprise. I had reached out to a state legislator, someone I met at a seminar, told her our story, shared the photos, walked her through the process. And with her help, we drafted a bill, the Residential Accessibility Protection Act, that would limit HOAs from blocking ADA-compliant modifications without clear legal cause. Last week, it passed the first reading. If it goes through, it'll become law. That means no more fines, no more shame, no more Karens telling people their mobility is an aesthetic disruption. It means legacy. Ours, legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a ramp 12 feet long, 36 inches wide, stained to match the trim of a modest house on Hemlock Drive. Other times, it's a quiet rule change that means no one else has to fight like you did. 6 months after the final hearing, I stood before a state subcommittee and gave sworn testimony. The room smelled like old carpet and coffee burned into styrofoam cups, but it felt like something sacred. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about something far older, dignity. I told them about Rachel, about the fines, the threats, the BBQ. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't have to. I just told the truth because the truth, when spoken plainly, carries more weight than any speech designed to stir applause. When I finished, one of the committee members asked, "Do you believe this law would have prevented what happened to you and your wife?" I looked down at my notes, then up again. "No," I said, because what happened to us wasn't just about a lack of law, it was about a lack of empathy. But the law gives people like Karen a boundary, and people like Rachel a shield. The bill passed, not unanimously, but enough. It's called Rachel's Ramp Law now. I didn't ask for the name. Someone added it during an amendment session. When I told Rachel, she didn't say anything. She just covered her face with her hands and cried into her palms for a long, quiet minute. Later that year, we threw a small celebration. Just a backyard gathering, nothing fancy. A few neighbors brought folding chairs. Someone grilled. Rachel wore a crown someone made out of pipe cleaners and string lights. I stood off to the side, watching her laugh, surrounded by people who used to fear Karen's clipboard like it was the Constitution. In that moment, I realized something. The fight had never been about the ramp. It wasn't even about the HOA. It was about the right to exist in peace, without apology, without shame, without being told you're inconvenient. We ended the night sitting on the porch, watching the sun set behind the oaks that lined Hemlock Drive. The ramp, that glorious, defiant piece of lumber, caught the last rays of light like a runway. Our runway. Rachel leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Promise me something." Anything I said. If someone else ever needs help like we did, you'll show up. I nodded. I already have, and I will. As long as I've got breath, I'll keep showing up. For the kid whose mom has to fight a board because her hearing aid ramp is too steep. For the couple who's told their son's walker can't be visible from the street. For the family who's tired, scared, and too beaten down to write the complaint themselves. I'll help them. I'll build them something, maybe not out of wood, but out of word support and law. Because freedom isn't won once, it's won again and again. One ramp, one rule, one voice at a time. And that's our legacy now. Not just the end of a terrible chapter, but the start of something better, something stronger, something accessible, forever. When I look back at everything we went through, I don't see just a fight with an HOA. I see the anatomy of change, the way small injustices build until they press into the soul, forcing a person to stand. I never intended to become an advocate. I didn't set out to challenge a system or change a law. All I wanted was for my wife to get out of our house safely with her head held high. But the truth is, when you're forced to fight for something that should have never been denied, you stop fighting just for yourself. You fight for the quiet ones, the tired ones, the people who look at a ramp or a curb or a closed door and think, maybe I just don't belong here. Rachel belongs everywhere, and so does everyone like her. That's what this story became. Not a vendetta, not a power play, but a blueprint. Proof that decency isn't a luxury, it's a standard. That rules, when twisted by the wrong hands, can do more harm than fists ever could. And that when you shine a light on those shadows calmly, persistently, legally, they don't survive the scrutiny. Since our HOA dissolved, I've helped 6 families challenge similar discrimination in their neighborhoods. Rachel's ramp law is gaining traction in 2 other states, and our little accessibility group. We now meet in a fully compliant building owned by the city, with automatic doors in a parking lot with 15 accessible spaces, just as it should be. We kept the ramp, of course. It's more than a structure now. It's a monument to resistance and quiet resolve. I restain it every spring, not just for upkeep, but for remembrance. Because what was once called an eyesore by someone clinging to control is now a symbol of progress. And maybe, just maybe, a warning to every Karen who thinks authority means righteousness. There are more of us. We're watching. We're documenting. We're showing up. And we're not going anywhere. Because freedom isn't granted. It's built. About a month after the HOA officially dissolved, when life had settled into a calm rhythm, again another situation crept up that tested everything I thought I'd put behind me. It started with a knock on the door, 3 short raps, urgent but polite. I opened it to find a young woman standing on our porch holding a clipboard and a baby on her hip. She introduced herself as Haley, said she had just moved into the neighborhood a few streets over with her husband and their infant daughter. She had heard about what happened with the HOA, the ramp, the lawsuit, and she hoped I might be able to help. Her voice shook a little when she asked. She wasn't sure if she was being dramatic, but something felt wrong. She explained that her backyard backed up to what used to be HOA green space. After the HOA disbanded, that land became unmanaged. Some of it reverted to city jurisdiction. Some fell into a sort of legal limbo. It wasn't much, just a patch of scrub, a few trees, an old footpath that led to the creek. But lately a man had been appearing there. Older, heavy-set, always wearing sunglasses and a zip-up windbreaker even in the heat. He'd stand on the trail behind her fence, staring into her yard, never speaking, never moving. Once she saw him writing something on a notepad. Another time he held up a phone and filmed her garden. The local police said it was public land, and unless he stepped onto her property, there wasn't much they could do. Her husband worked late hours and she was home alone with the baby most evenings. She admitted she was scared. What got to me wasn't the story itself, unsettling as it was, but the way she kept apologizing for telling it. Like asking for help made her a burden. That tone was familiar. That tone was, I told her I'd come by the next evening to take a look. No promises, just a neighbor willing to listen. Rachel nodded when I told her. We both knew that even though the HOA war was over, not all power games wore the same mask. When I arrived at Haley's house the next night, the sun was just starting to dip, casting long shadows across the dry grass of the empty lot behind her fence. The trail was still visible, though overgrown in places. I didn't see anyone at first, but I didn't expect to. These types usually vanish when confronted directly. I asked her to show me exactly where he stood. She pointed to a gap in the trees about 20 feet from her back gate. It was a clear line of sight to her porch and the nursery window. We waited. An hour passed, just the buzz of crickets and a dog barking somewhere down the block. Then just before dusk, he came. The man stepped out from behind a tree like he'd been waiting for darkness to grant him permission. He stood exactly where she'd said, arms crossed, staring. He didn't have binoculars or a camera, but he didn't need them. The intensity of his presence was enough. He didn't look around, just fixed his gaze on the house, on us. I walked to the back fence and stood tall so he could see me. I didn't say a word. Neither did he. He just turned and walked back into the brush like a ghost returning to its grave. Haley was visibly shaken, but grateful. I told her I'd look into it. I went home and did what I do best. I started researching. I pulled property records. I mapped out the old HOA green space parcels. I cross-referenced them with the city's planning department and found something odd. That particular strip of land hadn't reverted to the city. It was still listed under a private LLC, one that had ties to a local developer. Digging deeper, I found minutes from a city zoning meeting buried in a PDF file online. The developer had petitioned to repurpose that land for an access road to a new upscale housing project, but several properties, including Haley's, sat in the way. That man in the woods, he wasn't some creepy neighbor. He was a contracted surveyor. I drove to the site early the next morning, parked a block away and waited. Sure enough, a white pickup pulled up around 10. Same guy. He got out, checked his clipboard, and started walking the same path behind Haley's home. I approached him slowly, deliberately, staying calm. I asked him directly if he was surveying for an easement. He looked startled, then annoyed. Told me he wasn't at liberty to discuss his client's plans. I told him I wasn't asking as a neighbor. I was asking as someone who still had contacts at the zoning commission and knew how to file a cease and desist on behalf of private property owners. That got his attention. He walked back to his truck and left without another word. I didn't stop there. I contacted the zoning board, filed a formal request for all permits related to the proposed access road, and flagged the LLC for improper notice to adjacent homeowners. I helped Haley draft a letter to the commission asserting her rights under the state's private property protection statutes. I rallied 3 other nearby homeowners, shared the maps, and proposed road schematics, and by the end of the week, the project was under review. The surveyor never came back. A few weeks later, Haley invited Rachel and me over for dinner. It wasn't anything fancy, just grilled chicken corn on the cob and a homemade pie that looked store-bought but tasted like something someone's grandmother had perfected over years. The baby sat in a bouncer nearby, cooing as we talked. It was quiet, simple, free of fear. Before we left, Haley walked us to the door. She hesitated a second, then said, "I used to think people like you only existed in movies. You know, the kind who do something just because it's right." I smiled and shook my head. I just know what it feels like to be powerless, and I don't ever want to feel that way again, or let anyone else feel it either. She nodded, wiping at the corner of her eye. I didn't do it for thanks, but sometimes a quiet meal and a look of peace on a young mother's face is more powerful than any courtroom victory. That's the thing about standing up. The more you do it, the more others remember they can too. And I'll keep doing it, as long as there's a porch light on and someone knocking for help.